So this is the second part of the 6 lecture series for research methods. We're going to talk some about focus groups. So focus groups are going to be very similar in some senses to interviews, except you're going to be conducting them with a group of people. So if we think about what a focus group is, what you typically have is some invited group of participants, say 8 to 12 people. It's rare to get, might have 4 to 6, depending. Plus, you'll typically have some sort of a facilitator, the person who you could think of as the interviewer, but they are typically thought of as more facilitating a conversation amongst the participants. And you'll also often have observers. In fact, if you participate in these sorts of focus groups that are conducted by marketing companies, there'll often be a sort of a one-sided mirror of sorts, right? So that observers will often stand on the other side and they'll record you, etc. But you won't always be aware that there are observers there. There are cases, at least in some cases, I think business schools and some other research universities that have the same types of setups for conducting focus group type interviews, or at least they have set aside conference rooms with cameras for that type of observation if you don't have the sort of one-way glass. What's happening during that time is going to be some sort of a facilitated discussion in which participants might share their thoughts and feelings. Again, with marketing studies, this might be something like, what do you think of this product? Ask a few questions. What is it that you like about Trident? Right, there can be sort of those types of discussions. And with the closest that we tend to have to things like this, that you might have seen in political cases, you'll often have these online during the presidential campaign, right? So you'll see a bunch of focus groups there. You might just have as many as 20 or 30 people, but you'll have one person walking around asking questions. Those are a little bit different because those groups are often not talking to each other. You might also have sort of a deliberative democracy set up where you get a group of people, often a quite large one, that comes together to have a facilitated discussion. Finally, the facilitator will typically have an instrument or interview guide. So again, with a loose set of questions or material to be covered. So these will be a set of prompts, and much as we did in the case of the semi-structured interviews, a facilitator needs to have a pretty good grasp of what needs to be covered and sort of how long you can spend on each topic, sort of moving on. And even the facilitator won't be taking notes as they might during an interview because the whole thing is almost always being recorded and observed directly. So we talked just a little bit about here, but what are groups used for? So in marketing, you'll typically get things like product evaluation, product development, and advertising development. So you might sometimes be asked to look at 2 or 3 different advertising campaigns, say what you like about them, what you don't, what makes them work or not. You can do the same actually with political campaigns, of political marketing. So with political deliberation, are often used to sort of increase community participation. But also you get these, again, during elections, you'll get some sort of feedback, and electoral campaigns will sometimes use these focus group type settings, with basically sort of the idea being there's something additional that comes out of the focus groups that you might not get out of surveys, an issue which we'll return to. Sometimes companies and organizations will actually use focus groups as some part of a managerial process. So you'll sometimes have, for example, an external consultant come in and use focus groups, or sometimes they'll even be internal process facilitators. Usually the idea here is that you're trying to facilitate some sort of a political buy-in into some set of desired organizational changes or some other type of organizational change process. When we think about not just the sort of specific tasks, but in general, like what makes focus groups useful as a research tool, you can think about things like measuring self-presentation and impression management in a group, because the way, if you can imagine that while you typically have some sort of a self-impression management goals or other self-presentation goals, when you're talking to an interviewer, in essence, you can see how those sort of change within the group dynamic. Though they can be still tricky to measure because you're going to, in essence, have to recode language into those things. It can be really important in helping understand sort of brand and product appeal and other types of exploratory and informative evaluations. One of the nice things is that because you can probe a little bit more deeply into answers, much as with semi-structured interviews, in fact. You can sometimes get a little bit more understanding of the reasoning behind why people say what they do. And sometimes, even if you push hard enough, you can get, and if you code well enough, you can get some insight into these sort of implicit, sort of automatic, or system 2 type responses, right? Because you can sort of extrapolate something from this precise wording that people use, or the sort of pauses they take, or even the pattern of conversation itself, which we'll talk about a little bit in a minute. And finally, and I think most importantly, is that focus groups are fantastic if you're interested in group dynamics. If you want to understand the dynamic of group conversation, you can't always understand that at all. So it's like one of the very few ways we can understand that type of a phenomenon. So if you haven't participated in one before, what's actually going on in the room? In essence, there'll typically be some sort of an introduction. A facilitator will lead off with a topic, sometimes having people introduce themselves, though, again. So the introduction will be not just about the topic, but actually having people introduce themselves and tell something about themselves. The facilitator will sort of introduce a topic, and will usually then try to basically guide discussion by doing things like calling on people who are quiet, sort of trying to move around if one person's dominating the conversation, probing again on particular follow-up questions to try to get people to answer them. So again, the facilitator's job is basically to try to ensure balanced participation and full coverage of topics, and will typically take place for up to 2.5 hours. They're rarely shorter than an hour. They typically are fairly lengthy. Again, the point of this is that you've got group dynamics. Now, recall, though, that one thing about having a facilitator there is that these are group dynamics in which the facilitator is often trying to actively change the group dynamic. So it's a little bit less natural, for example, than, say, just observing a group meeting itself in a more natural or sort of state. So if you can imagine sitting in on staff meetings and observing those, it's not going to be the same as a facilitator. You'll probably be more likely to see one person doing a lot of talking, maybe other people being quiet, unless you have someone actively facilitating. These differences. Here, I'm not going to include it in this lecture, but there's a fantastic video on YouTube that is definitely worth watching, because if you haven't seen a focus group before, it is eye-opening to sit and watch one. So click on the link and you can be taken to YouTube, and it's fairly short to watch. So what were some of the hopes and realities for focus groups? In essence, the original hopes for focus groups were that people would recall forgotten details. The reality, though, is that people typically only discuss common ground because they're, in essence, strangers in an unfamiliar environment. So one might wish that people would, sort of prompt each other to go deeper into conversation, but in fact, they're so nervous or so concerned with not sort of saying something too different from what other people do, that there tends to be some sort of herding towards common ground. You might think, again, that it would widen range responses, but it doesn't. Again, we get this, we tend to have this, in essence, what you tend to do is all go towards a single point. Now, if the people involved are quite different, you'll typically have people meeting in the middle. But if, for example, you have people that are more the same or assume it themselves to be the same, so for example, if you have a group of all women or all men, you'll tend to get more towards these polar, in essence, you polarize, but not within the group, but actually across the groups, right? Because groups will tend to converge. The question is just basically whether they converge towards endpoints, so basically become all more extreme than any single group member, or do they tend to moderate? And a lot of that has to do with expectations of what the people around you are going to be thinking or not. There have been some really interesting research studies showing this both in focus group research and also in jury decision making. The idea of focus groups, again, was that there was going to be some reduction of inhibition, sort of the social desirability effects that we think are there in surveys would not be there. Of course, as you can imagine, they actually can get heightened. Instead, what you can typically have is increased inhibition, and in fact, you can end up with hierarchy where a few people dominate the conversation, at least if you don't have a skilled facilitator. And again, we might hope for a naturalistic setting, but instead you've got these strangers in an unfamiliar environment. So the idea is that there were sort of a lot of these original hopes, but then the realities, of course, are that we get this very different type of dynamic, precisely because you've got these people who don't sort of know each other. They are therefore only discussing common ground. Now, one thing that hasn't been explored as much in detail in the research literature, though there are some hints of it, is that you might be able to bring in people who already know each other, and then you might get some more interesting conversations because there's more trust and an ability to sort of do things like recall forgotten details or widen random responses. But it's not always clear what the point of that would always be, and if it would really be any better than just surveys or other interviews, unless what you're real interested again here is in these group dynamics. So recruitment, clearly one of the things that we should sort of understand from this last discussion about the issue of strangers is that the other group members actually matter. So you want to think about the composition of your groups, right? Do you want them to be more or less homogeneous or more heterogeneous? Usually in marketing, we tend to see a lot of homogeneous groups, right? So they want to have a bunch of women ages 30 to 40 with at least one child or something, right? So you want to have people who you think are in your target demographics, and you want them all come together and talk. For marketing, you can see that would make sense because often people who are not just really interested in the targeting campaign, but also in how those marketing campaigns, in essence, get diffused through interpersonal discussion with friends, and women are often most likely to be like to like. So you're going to tend to be friends with other people who sort of have a similar background, and so shared demographic characteristics. Political groups tend to be more heterogeneous because people are often interested in how people overcome difference or what happens when you get different people from different backgrounds, like how can they sort of compromise politically or not. Pay for focus groups is usually quite high, particularly for difficult to reach groups. It's not at all unusual to see people getting paid $200 or $300 to participate, at least in marketing studies. It's a little bit different with political studies, obviously. But the idea is that, particularly when you're interested in things like high income or busy professionals, you're going to pay quite a lot. If you're recruiting 20 to 25-year-old people with high school degrees, you might be able to get them for $50 for an hour and a half. But it very much depends on how available the people that you're trying to reach are as to what the going rate is. Facilitation we've mentioned briefly, but just important to keep in mind that facilitation matters tremendously. One thing that can end up happening is a facilitator might actually make things more likely to go to consensus, which is a common mistake. But one thing facilitation can actually do, if it's done well, is help draw out differences of opinion. So a good facilitator who notices a small hesitancy and who encourages someone to say, I sort of see that you don't seem completely convinced, could you tell me why? Might be more likely to draw out differences of opinion than a facilitator who sort of misses that moment and moves on. Because in essence, by recognizing and seeing the hesitancy, the facilitator has in essence okayed it. They said it's okay to sort of not agree, and we aren't going to judge you for it. So they've sort of proven that they're sort of on the person's side to some extent, even though they aren't completely. But again, a lot of that is about good facilitation depends on dealing with group dynamics. And as one can imagine, this is particularly essential in political liberation and focus groups. Now, one problem that, of course, we face is that we don't tend to offer people training in this. In my own previous career, I was trained to be a facilitator, and it took weeks of study, and then there were like a 2 weeks in which you actually went to camp, in essence, to do this. So it actually sort of learning to do this well, and then you have to usually keep up the skills and practice them, is much more demanding than just sort of walking into a room and thinking you can do things. And it's unfortunately not a skill that's often being taught, for better or for worse, at least in the university and research worlds.